I'm Stephen Petronio. I am the artistic director of Stephen Petronio Dance Company, which is currently celebrating its 35th anniversary.
I'm Roger Copeland. I taught theater and dance at Oberlin College for too long, 40 some years, and I've written a lot about Merce Cunningham and the Judson era of dance and Balanchine, and so I'm a dance goer, a pretty avid one.
So I was, in preparation for this, I was trying to really remember when I first met you, and I know it was on stage at Oberlin College after a performance, and I was dancing. I was currently a dancer with, then I was a dancer with Trisha Brown.
Right. And it, 80, or guess 85's probably pretty close, because Set and Reset premiered 84. In like 83, 84, I think.
I think 84.
The Next Wave Festival.
Yeah.
So it certainly would have been in the repertory then.
And it was kind of at the end. It was, I left in 86, so. And I remember a very lively conversation. We might have been talking about the piece before, even.
It's possible.
Anyway,
but
it's been a long.
But that's a good place to start, because I was gonna ask you to chat a little bit about the Bloodlines project, and of course the fact that your bloodline goes back to Trisha Brown and then moves in other directions.
It goes back to Paxton, actually.
That's true. That's true. So
Steve Paxton,
a bloodline that moves like this.
Okay, so I started dancing in 1974 at Hampshire College, and I took an improvisation class as a.
Was Becky there, Rebecca?
No,
okay.
she wasn't. She might have been a grad student at the time, but
I didn't know you were at Hampshire.
I went to Hampshire, and so I was pre-med, because being the first son of an Italian working class family, I had to be a doctor. So I got a scholarship to Hampshire, and I was going pre-med, and then I took a dance class for amusement, and the lightning bolt struck me in that first semester, major, oh my God, my body. And then Steve Paxton was a guest artist.
In
that moment. And so I saw Steve Paxton dance, and then I began to learn contact improvisation from him.
And there's an Oberlin, talk about crisscrossing bloodlines. There is, of course, an Oberlin connection here, because in a very real sense, contact was sort of created by Steve and Nancy Stark Smith during what we call a winter term
Nancy was a student
January.
There, and it was Magnesium.
That's right.
It was a piece that he did, Magnesium.
What a good
I'll tell you why, because Eleanor Euston was a student there as well. I think Brenda Way was kind of overseeing from San Francisco.
She's the person who hired me. Yeah.
So I think she was overseeing that whole thing. And then so Eleanor, who then later became my girlfriend, was a grad student at Smith.
Wow.
And so she brought Paxton in, and she was teaching in Hampshire a little bit, and she brought Paxton into Hampshire. And then that's how I met him, and so it was a very, very small circle of friends. And so Steve really, taught me that I could develop a vocabulary of my own, and I had to be an improviser.
Right.
So I began building my language very early. Like at the beginning of my dancing first steps, I was building an improvisational language. And then he introduced me to Trisha Brown. So the Judsons were really my classicists. They were what I was.
Interesting.
They were what I knew.
And Steve had danced, however briefly, with Cunningham.
Yes, for sure.
And in a certain sense, set out to unlearn some of that technique for his Judson work, or at least go beyond it.
No, I think. Well, I would. He probably looked at it as unlearning, but when you saw Steve solo,
Goldberg.
The virtuosity in his body, it was astounding, and but there was also a much more factual interest that he had in the physics of his body. So he prepared me for Trisha, and I always say that Trisha, Steve and Trisha were doing some very similar things with the body in terms of sequence and energy and flow and continuum.
Right.
But Steve was committed to never repeating it, and Trisha was committed to memorizing it.
Yeah.
So when Steve passed me in some cosmic way to Trisha, I couldn't believe she was learning that kind of material, and so that's really where I carried on the idea of learning.
It's funny, at the Bessies a couple of years ago, Paxton got some kind of Lifetime Achievement Award, something like that, and he was in Paris at the time teaching a work of his to French dancers, and he said, I've got some advice. Have at least one piece of choreography that you can teach. So he was talking about the monetary value of not working entirely in an improvisational.
Interesting.
So I thought.
Well, there's another story in there which I'll tell you later. But the so those guys, those people were my introduction to dance, the Judsons. So when I hit my 30th anniversary, and Merce passed away and Trisha became gravely ill, I just realized that the model that I was pursuing, which was to be the reign of a kingdom at the end of my life that would be passed on to a bunch of other people, it didn't seem contemporary, and it didn't seem like, I just didn't feel like that was what was going to be for me.
Right.
And so, and I was so very saddened by both of their, the loss of both of them, and so, and it was the 30th anniversary, and I was thinking about, I was reassessing, and so I decided the most radical thing I could do was stop focusing just on my own work and to bring their work into my company in some ways, and the choreographers that influenced me and that delivered me to the world, because I always think there's this idea from the public that you drop down from the sky a genius, and
right.
It's,
and in the dance world especially, there is less sense of history and continuity often. But,
and I was taught things from people, and I don't know. I think also because of limited resources, we tend to. And because of individuality is so prized, we tend to hide all that. And I know I did for many years that I didn't talk about my sources so much, and so I just decided to blow that open and bring them into my world, and then to frame my own work with the lens of people looking at their works and my dancers looking at embodying their works. Instead of getting the information from me and not really knowing it. To actually learn those things and see the genesis of certain movements in my world that come from Paxton or Brown or Cunningham
it's
or
an added
Rayner.
Level of accomplishment and excitement to know that what you're doing is part of a continuum.
Well, and also it's an embodied continuum.
Right.
So it's not just my history.
Right. Well, actually, so that sort of leads to the question I was going to ask next, and maybe something that I just learned today, that you were a pre-med student at one point. Maybe that explains the choice of the term bloodlines as the metaphor. Because normally people talk about roots and branches of the tree, the apple, not falling too far from, but
Petronio.
Right.
Familia.
God.
So
bloodline you can't refuse.
Yeah, exactly.
Okay.
So I think that's where it came from. Right. But before I started Bloodlines, which was meant to only be a 5-year investigation of the people that inspired me, a very not a survey of postmodernism, but a very personal look at what floated my boat into where I am. Before I did that, a precursor to the project was. And it was Steve. It was about Steve, because Steve was one of the first men I saw dance. I mean, officially, I saw Nureyev do Sleeping Beauty as a graduation present from high school, and I went kicking and screaming. And then the next thing I saw was Steve Paxton.
Wow, about two complementary poles.
Yeah.
Wow.
And two very different men offering very different models of masculinity and movement and aesthetic. But so at a certain point before the Bloodlines project, Steve had a piece called Intravenous Lecture.
That's right.
And I decided to honor him in some way. Well, I thought it was honoring him, but I'd only read about it. I didn't really know what it was. I couldn't find out much about it. I knew he was hooked up to a saline drip, but I called him and I asked him if he would allow me to do it. So, literally, a doctor or a nurse hooks you up to an intravenous saline drip, and maybe that's where Bloodlines came from. So.
Make sure there's some smelling salts just in case I.
A few people did faint.
A few people did faint, couch, but yeah, I didn't realize how literal that connection to the bloodline was. So let's talk a little bit about the 3 works on the current program at Skirball. So you've added yet another Cunningham piece to the repertory. This is Tread.
We started. Right. So Bloodline started with. I decided to start with Cunningham. Right. The first thing we did was Rainforest.
Right.
And so immediately when I knew I was going to go to Merce, because Merce really wasn't. I didn't study Cunningham technique, but I've seen it since day one, living in New York, and I just felt that while many people don't consider him postmodern, I think he was the instigator of many, many things.
I mean, that's where a whole new conception of, if there's a bloodline that goes, say, from Duncan through Graham or Wigman, then something very different starts with Cunningham, and then the Judson people all owe their lineage to him or to Cage.
Well, they fractured space from the frontal plane to the grid. Right. Paxton made it a sphere, and and that's the world that I came into. So. So I started with Merce. So this is the 3rd Cunningham work that we've done. Right. We did Rainforest,
and Signals,
and now Tread.
Right.
And so we've been working with the Trust very closely. But I knew I wanted to do 3 because I didn't think we could make much headway with and have much dialogue with just one.
Interesting. So how did you decide on Tread, which is the piece that I don't think I've seen since 1970? Well, and I remember the fans.
Yeah. Well, interestingly enough, the Trust made the suggestion to me for Tread because we've gotten to know each other. Over the
that's great. So in other words, there's a piece that they think should have a second life.
They were like, Stephen, this hasn't been seen. We think this might be really suited to you, and I'm I have no problem with that at all. I mean, it was a good discussion, and interestingly enough, because I hadn't seen Tread, and many people haven't seen Tread, a lot of them, and this happens to many people in the arts, especially when they're interested in history, and I am. I see a picture in 1970 4, and it becomes this fantasy object for me. So and you never see the performance, but you see the thing, and so you create this mystique in your head. And so I made a piece in my head that was called Tread, and the foreground, the fan. So for those people who don't know it, there's a series of fans by Bruce Nauman, industrial fans across the proscenium edge. And so the audience is looking through these fans at the dance, and the fans are on and they're oscillating. Right. So you're feeling a breeze, and you're feeling something, and you're watching the dance through.
I'll tell you something funny. I, as happenstance would have it, I found myself, first time it was performed, Brooklyn Academy of Music, 1970. I was sitting next to the late Clive Barnes, and he kept complaining, I'm going to catch a cold from this dance. So, because we could feel the breeze.
Yeah, well, last night it was exciting because we had it for the first time last night, and it was super exciting.
But what I thought was fantastic about the dance was the way the fans function as a visual barrier of sorts. And so, many times when you viewed a dancer through the spinning grid of the fan, it looked as if they'd been vivisected for a second.
That's funny.
It was, for me, it put Tread in that subcategory of Cunningham pieces like Scramble, where Frank Stella created a series of sort of color-filled images, cloth stretched on a moving grid, and then there's the Jasper Johns version of Duchamp's Large Glass in Walk Around Time, and a whole series of works around that time in the 60s where Cunningham's designer put some sort of visual obstacle between the dancers and the audience, and it sort of encourages you to look harder.
You look through, and it's something I learned intuitively by seeing that picture. because I later became obsessed with putting obstacles in front of, and it's kind of like Rauschenberg painting over. What's the famous painting that he whites out?
In the de Kooning.
The Erased de Kooning.
Yeah, that's right.
So that idea of and it's kind of the ultimate punk rock gesture, and Cunningham can get away with it. Put the fans there.
And of course, Trisha in Newark, had those Donald Judd drops coming down at different distances from.
From that photograph, I learned intuitively, put something in front of it, and you look harder at the thing.
Cezanne says we see more clearly on a cloudy day.
I love that. So it was beautiful to bring it back for that reason, because and the same thing with Intravenous Lecture. I'd read the title, and the title was so vivid that I made this whole thing up about it, and then I got to learn what it actually was. So that's a really beautiful part of these investigations, to embody and bring back what the object actually is for this next generation of viewers. And in the process, I'm getting to re-educate myself. And if it, so for example, the idea of the barrier, I didn't know, I didn't really understand my obsession with that. It's just, I absorbed it as a young dance goer, or as a young thinker and looker at art. It wasn't something I studied, or I just stumbled onto it and absorbed it. So that's really interesting to me. And then for the works that I've seen, for example, like Rainforest, it's like reading a great book over again, except I'm reading it now as a mature.
Sure.
Some people would consider me mature, and some wouldn't, but as a more mature person. And then also to go. When I went to Chicago, I went with to Columbia College. I went with Rainforest and Trisha Brown's Glacial Decoy, one of my own works, Non-Locomotor. And one woman came up to me in tears and said, I've only read about Glacial Decoy. I thought I missed my chance, and so thank you so much. So it's beautiful to do that as well.
Absolutely, it is an extraordinary piece. Let's talk a little bit about the Rudy Perez piece, which initially I had confused with probably his best known solo called Countdown, which is the smoking piece. Which I actually saw him
smoking
perform.
And crying. There's a tear in it, right?
That's right. That's right. I saw him do that at the American Dance Festival at Connecticut
He's an
College.
intense performer.
Extraordinary. So this piece called Coverage.
Well, this version is called Coverage Revisited. So there's another photographic story here. So when I was at Hampshire College in 1974, and I decided that I was interested in dance, of course I began studying about dance history as much as I could, and I read Don McDonald's book,
Rise and Fall and Rise of Modern
Dance.
Very helpful book.
Very helpful, and it had just come out
at
that, not a few years before. And in that book, which was full of legendary postmodern and modern dancers, was a picture of Rudy Perez, and he was one of the few people of color in the book.
Certainly in that world, absolutely.
And I was, although I didn't know him, and I didn't really. I didn't really get to see his work in New York because he had already moved to the West Coast.
I was going to say, because he's been in LA for so long now.
But the picture really fascinated me, and he struck me, and that picture has stayed with me for a very long time. And when I was thinking about what I would be programming next, I realized that I am now, in some ways, holding the keys to a very white postmodern world. And I just thought, well, we need to have Rudy.
Sure.
Rudy needs to be represented. People don't really know him here. And so he's still alive. I called him up. He's 89. He's having some health problems. His blindness is an issue, and he's not completely blind, but I just felt this was the moment for him and for me to bring him forward. And so, I will say it was not an ideal situation because his documentation was hard to get, and he's incapacitated. He couldn't come here. We couldn't afford to spend the whole time there. So we agreed to do it mostly through video, which I think was very frustrating for him in the end, because he's very emotional, and when he is talking about his work, he's 20 years old again. and very, very clear and very articulate and very he's a very demanding guy, and very intense guy. And but he did in the end send us someone to help restage, Sarah Swanson, who helped us enormously to get down to this. The essence of Rudy's work is very pedestrian and very emotional, but in a very plain way, and it's deceivingly simple. Yeah. And he really demanded that we strip away any veneers of dancerliness, which of course my dancers are very good at, because I do a very dancey dancing.
It's tough to divest yourself of all that training.
So it was like putting paint thinner over paint thinner. I mean, he really stripped it back and stripped it back and stripped it back until right before the show we got to an essence of that was very, very plain. And that's what was presented last night.
Because I think of a lot of his work as being about, what some of the contenders for the Democratic Party nomination at the moment would call the dignity of work. Yeah. That we associate tasks of various sorts with a lot of Judson era work, and oftentimes, say in the case of Rayner's Trio A, that task may be completely non-utilitarian, but in Perez's work, I mean, I remember thinking, that's like something that people really do for a utilitarian reason, but we overlook its dignity. It's done by workers.
He does do that, but there's an emotional undercurrent that's at play as well, and it has to do with sexuality, and I believe it has to do with otherness because of his race.
Right.
And especially in coverage, there's a hard hat and a coverall that comes off, and there's the national anthem is being played, and so there's a relationship to himself as an other in a very confined space that he works within. And so it's kind of his salute to that position in America at that time.
Right.
And there were a lot of people in the audience that have lived through the 70s. This is also from 1970. And a lot of the works from Bloodlines are from 1970.
Interesting, because Tread's also 1970.
So I'm really obsessed with that period because that's kind of when I started dancing.
Which I think of as still very much the 60s.
So,
well,
I started in 74, so I'm very interested in that period because there's a big shift going on there, and I want, that's how I ended up in dance.
And it seems that my definition of the 60s starts with the Kennedy assassination in 63 and ends with Nixon leaving the White House after Watergate in 74. So there we go.
Interesting.
So we would be remiss in not talking a little bit about the new Petronio work on the program as well.
American Landscapes. So when he got elected a couple years ago.
Good. Let's keep it at he as opposed to
my utter mortification and was deep. And so the only thing I could think of doing was making the most beautiful abstract object that I could do and that I could make. So I buried myself into this formal exploration, and it's so I made something called Hardness 10, and it was one of the it's a very singular structured work where people are walking and then dancing very virtuosically out of that walk and back into the walk, and I really stuck with that for 20-something minutes, and I've never done something that intensely single-mindedly structured before. I'm more used to using structure in service of a larger arc, and this was really in service of confinement of the idea. So we did that, and it was very satisfying. And now that it's 2 years later, I felt that I had to do something that I would be. There would be something wrong with me not at least pointing at some of the pain that I feel has been inflicted on our nation and what it's looking like right now, while still offering some beauty of the body. So I made this work, American Landscapes, and I chose to collaborate with Robert Longo, who's the great American New York artist. And at the moment, he's doing these what he does is takes photographs from contemporary, or what he's doing right now is taking photographs from contemporary news cycles and making these massive very realistic charcoal renderings of these situations.
So presumably less abstract than before we turned the camera on the Men in the Cities series we were talking about.
These are
where
graphic depictions of scenes.
Right.
For example, the police barricade of Ferguson.
And recognizable as such. Or
totally.
as,
if you've been alive in the last 2 years, are very recognizable. What else? There's there's atom bomb explosions. There's a lot. So it's grouped into 3 sections. There's natural images to start, but with something quite not right. Kind of decimated forests, and, waves crashing, and American flags that disintegrate over the course of.
But these are all rendered in graphite.
They're graphite, and then made into projections that are on a 3-screen system that shift very slowly through the course of the piece. And then they move into more troubled images like soldiers and bombs and twin towers and Russian jet fighters and that part of our reality. And then it moves into the final stage, which is back to nature, but even more troubled, ice sheets melting and things like that. So, and it does end with a kind of
so nature is not an idyllic retreat from our problems, but in fact has been corrupted.
Circle it on your calendar because it's coming.
Or going.
It's here. So, and so he's framing the work. He's framing this work with these very specific images. And I decided to make the dance. I've experimented with several ways of working with it, but I decided to let the images in the dance run on simultaneous cycles, and I really avoided commenting with the body on these images. But I did. There's one moment where the dance and the images intersect directly, and it's when the dancers take a knee at one point, and from that historical moment, and that image is up at the same time. So
now, are there other moments in the dance, even if they don't in some way correspond to the image, that we would read as iconic of a particular reality?
Yeah, they're just not simultaneous.
Got it.
Well, for example, there is a line of police from Ferguson on the images at one point.
Right.
Earlier in the dance, there's a line of dancers, kind of a unified line of dancers. So yeah, there are of course there are relationships, but and there are references, but they don't match up except for that one point. And I felt it was one of the most tender points of the dance, and the right one to mirror exactly. So.
Right. And tell me a little about the musical score commission.
Yes, so the musical score, I'm very lucky to have Joseph Van Meisem and Jim Jarmusch. Joseph is playing lute and acoustic guitar, and Jim is playing electric guitar. Now, you think lute is a weird choice for something called American Landscapes, but he really sounds kind of like a banjo. And he's made it very meditative. He's built it in a palindrome, so it starts at A and it ends at A. And it's a very meditative score. And when Jim comes in...
Now, did they perform it live?
They didn't perform it live. We had visa issues. They were supposed to perform it live, and we tried it till this week. But you can thank him again, who was elected 2 years ago. It's harder to get in and out.
And of course, after Brexit, it's going to be
even worse.
That much harder for British and European artists. Anyway,
So Jim comes in and at the point when the imagery and the dance become very dissonant and more politically driven in terms of trouble on the streets. Jim comes in with the electric guitar, and it's so it's a really I love what they've done. I really feel honored, and this collaborative team has been pretty exciting.
So what's next for you now? Is the Bloodlines project going to continue?
It's
or
continuing. Yes,
Great.
Next year we're looking.
So are you at liberty to reveal?
I haven't really announced it yet, but I am talking to one of the great structuralists of postmodernism. I'll tell you that. I think minimal structurals. And I'm also I'm talking to David Gordon as well.
Great.
Who these people all live in the same building in Soho.
Fantastic.
And I was right up and down that elevator every day. So to me, I'm living in the same world. That,
the Gordon work that I would love to see revived. I mean, it's technically more a play, a work of dramatic literature. Do you remember The Family Business?
Yeah,
and
of course I do.
Was Aine and Balda and David, and it was a kind of meta-drama about. I have the fondest memories of that.
You know what's the fun thing about Bloodlines is everybody wants me to do something.
That's right.
Specific.
That's right. Well, I was hawking you, trying to get you to do Biped, which
that's true. That's way too big.
Like
way too big for me.
Yeah.
But I only have 9 dancers, so I would need more for that.
Yeah.
But David is an interesting choice for me, and because we don't generally talk, and so David generally talks, so we'll see how that goes. I mean, we dance. So,
that's great. Well, I assume whatever of David's you wind up doing will involve some chairs, one way or another. I'd be very disappointed.
Very possible.
If it didn't, because
very possible. Well, even with Rudy, the minute I said I was going to be working with Rudy Perez, everybody had an opinion, and it was not what I chose. And because what I chose is it's a tricky piece because it is so simple, and it is not the famous ones.
Right. Yeah, because Countdown is the one.
Countdown is one that everybody wanted me to do.
And I think Dance Theater of Harlem didn't they do a reconstruction of it? I thought.
Well,
maybe 10 years ago.
Ailey did
the Ailey company.
Ailey did coverage. But part of the issue with Rudy is that the archival access to archives was tricky. Mm-hmm. So part of it was that I could get this, but I fell in love with it. So.
Right. Good. I may be misremembering this, but I think I saw a piece that was attributed to Rudy at Connecticut College. It would have been the early 70s. It must have been a one-time only site-specific event, but I think it involved automobiles that were moving around. And I've conflated some memories. I mean, I saw a piece involving automobiles and I thought it was Rudy's, but
I like the idea, though.
We will do some detective work on that.
Okay. So one of the other things I'm doing, talking, just about thinking about the future. Everyone has said, "What's next?" Well, I've mapped out what's next. So for the next part of my life, I'm going to be making new work for myself. I'm going to be investigating the people that I love in Bloodlines, and the third jewel in my crown right now is we started a research and development retreat for choreographers up in the Hudson Valley.
Wow.
In a town called Round Top. And I got it started with a very big gift from Anish Kapoor, who I collaborated with, and he allowed me to sell one of his works of art that got us in. And so we have a 175 acre property with it could sleep 10, and it's got a 2,500 square foot studio, and so we are committed to helping the next generation in the fashion and the bloodline that I come from to build the new work. And
this will happen in the summer?
This is year 2, and so it's the summer. It's more of a summer project. And it was conceived as a summer project because I thought I was going to be working in a barn somewhere upstate, but I found this all-weather facility. But raising the money to do it all year round is very difficult. So it's limited to the summer, and we did one season last season, and we're in the process of putting together.
Now, how do you choose the choreographers?
Okay, so it's a national. So we every year we invite a network of national presenters to submit 3, and it's a very diverse panel. We're really committed to diversifying the free sources that we have that go to art making, And so they nominate 3 people each, and then we.
Great. So people don't apply.
Nobody applies. No. So they're nominated, and then I have. So they're all producers and presenters, and then this the selection panel are only artists, and they're also in the last 2 years they've been artists of a certain age, kind of more of the elders of the field in the postmodern field, and very diverse as I can be, and so that's the project that I think I will be raising money for the rest of my days.
That is tremendous.
Yeah.
So the choreographers who are invited, they get
here's what they get. They get right now it's a week for up to 10 people. So it could be 10 dancers or 9 dancers in themselves, or it could be their family and 3 dancers, or it could be 2 dancers. It could be their collaborative team. They get fed 3 meals a day by an amazing organic chef, and a lot of the food is grown at the garden. The garden was donated by a beautiful artist friend of ours, Cindy Sherman, and so she donated an organic garden.
I've heard of her, yes.
And my husband, Jean-Marc Flack, designed these raised beds. And one of the funny things that we found is that a lot of the dancers from the city don't like to be out in nature, and we're in the middle, on a mountaintop in the forest. So he's developed these beds where you can sit on the edge and interact socially, so that you can get close to the garden even if you're not. And they also get a couple of cars to some transportation budget, because we are at the end of the road on the mountaintop, so they need transportation. And they get a $5,000 stipend. So
very nice. And they are then free to use that time and space.
Sometimes I'm there, sometimes I'm not.
Is there an obligation to show something at the end of them?
Look, I'm an artist who's conceived this. There's no obligation.
That's nice.
They don't have to. I mean, Ralph Lemon was our first, and he drew. I think he drew most of the time. So
that's great.
We invite them to do things in the town if they want to, because part of the issue is of raising money is how does the town get to understand what we're doing, and so we do other events there, and we hold yoga retreats and stuff like that too. But our mission is really research and development, because it's the least sexy thing to sell. So generally a patron could see curtains or costumes or a set, and they understand what they're doing, what they're giving money to. But the idea of going into the studio and maybe doing nothing is not that fundable. So I'm committed to and that's the thing that we all need to make work of value. So I'm committed to funding that.
And that's the best sort of angel, broadly construed, one who isn't requiring that you show something, because it's it may be the seed that gets planted that isn't gonna blossom for a while, and so the artificial deadline that
we're very good.
What you've got.
We're very good at when the curtain goes up performing,
right?
Like like a trained seal.
That's right.
But and we will, but to take that curtain away. Makes the process that you're involved with a very different proposition.
Absolutely. And
so it's called the Petronio Residency Center at Crow's Nest.
That is great. This is the first I have heard about it.
You should go onto my website, go to petronio.io, and you can click on the retreat page and you'll learn more about it. And if anybody out there wants to send some money our way, come on.
Sounds good. To the future. And retreating both backwards and forward. So it's, Balanchine used to say, forward to Petipa.
I like that. That's beautiful. I like that.